Hello, Seawolves, and welcome to the Stony Brook Media Group's live election night broadcast. I'm Sky Crabtree.
And I'm Andrew Candio. We have lots of insightful stories for you all. First, our reporter Miles Reese will be speaking with Richard McCormick, the interim president of Stony Brook University, and the dean of College Arts and Science, David Warble, on the historical significance of this presidential election.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to Stony Brook University's Election Night Live. I'm Miles Reese, and joining me here in the studio tonight, we have Stony Brook University's president, Richard McCormick, as well as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, David Robel. Thank you so much again, guys, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Yes.
It's our pleasure.
So I really want to get into a deep dive of the history of the elections of the United States. And starting with you, President McCormick, what are some of the historical elections, in your view, that pivoted American elections and the society?
That's a great question. I'm going to mention two. I'll start with the election of 1800. That was an election that pitted Thomas Jefferson against the incumbent President John Adams. It was a bitter election. They called each other terrible names in the newspaper. They accused each other of outrageous things. And when the votes were counted, Jefferson had won, and he became the third president of the United States. John Adams was deeply bitter about losing. He had expected to win. He believed he deserved a second term, just as George Washington had a second term. But you know what he did? He got on his horse and he rode back to Quincy, Massachusetts, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He didn't like losing, but he accepted his loss. And in accepting it, he set a standard. He established a tradition that all the disappointed presidential candidates followed ever since. No one likes to lose an election. No one especially likes to lose a presidential election. But our democracy depends upon the loser accepting defeat and walking away. Every presidential loser since John Adams did that until 2020.
And for you, Mr. Robel, would you agree? And also to add on to the president's notion just there, what are some of the pivotal moments in election history that you think changed the election cycle for the rest of time?
Okay, well, I'll talk about three, and then we should probably jump back and talk about one more in the 19th century. So at the end of the 19th century, 1896, William McKinley, the Republican candidate, running against William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic Party candidate and also the representative of the Populist Party. It was a sort of fusion ticket bringing together the Democratic and Populist constituencies. It was an incredibly bitter election. The candidates presenting each other as the antithesis of decent civilization. McKinley was presented as as the epitome of corporate greed. William Jennings Bryan was presented as the epitome of radicalism. There are some parallels to the present election in 1896. If we jump forward 36 years to 1932, this pivotal election in the midst of the Great Depression, a nation reaching a low point in its economic horizons, levels of unemployment incredibly high, children dying of malnutrition-related diseases, and the big issue was, what role does the government have in addressing the needs of the populace when an economy fails, as it had? And that was a bitter divide between Herbert Hoover, the Republican candidate, and FDR, the Democratic candidate. And that's a moment where the role of the government expands after the 32 election, and tremendous animosity towards that expansion of the government in elections since on the part of the Republican Party. 1968, jump forward another 36 years from 32, 1968, Richard Nixon running against Hubert Humphrey, the bitter backdrop of the Vietnam War, some of the riots taking place in American cities, incredibly tense situation at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, police attack student protesters, That's an election where you see the Republican Party clearly positioning itself as the party of law and order against student radicalism and the radicalism of the left in general. So those are three sort of bitterly divided elections that provide some parallels to tonight.
Yes, as I was saying, and as to your point as well, there's many things throughout history that makes a lot of these elections confusing to teach as well. And it's really interesting to hear your thoughts. So just stay with us for a moment. We're going to throw things back to the studio. So our viewers at home, just stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Thank you, Miles. During this election, Americans have the ability to vote in the first African-American woman to be President of the United States. Now, our reporter, Miles Reese, will be interviewing Melba Tolliver, the first African-American woman to anchor network news.
I am concerned about the future of America. I happen to agree with the Kerner Commission when it said, quote, by failing to portray the Negro as a matter of routine and in the context of the total society, the news media have contributed to the black-white schism in this country.
This excerpt from the Kerner Report is being read by the powerhouse journalist herself, Melba Tolliver. Since her debut on ABC News in 1967, she's covered many topics on the air, including politics. We traveled to Bangor, Pennsylvania, and spoke to her on her thoughts about the state of the 2024 presidential election and its coverage.
One of the major primetime seasons for broadcast and for reporting is the election season, in journalism, especially for political reporting. Now, we're on the horizon of one of the most controversial, unprecedented elections of a lifetime in U.S. history. What would you say is something that Americans across the country should pay attention to throughout the coverage of the election in order to figure out what candidate they're going to pick for November, especially in Americans who are in swing states such as Pennsylvania, where we are right now?
Pay attention to how much time you spend watching television news and reading daily papers, fewer and fewer of them. Pay attention how much time are you spending. I think it's not a good idea to spend a lot of time just overwhelmed by the coverage, which for me, and I'm very critical in a negative way of a lot of the coverage, which to me is not real reporting, it's repeating. And so it's the same thing over and over and over and over again.
This election obviously is different in many ways, but one particular way, this is the first time that a black woman has been the head of the Democratic ticket and is, going up against a Republican who's also on the presidential ticket. And this is the first time that this has happened. So how does this make you feel for the future of politics in America?
First of all, because I'm not sure when I'm talking to somebody if we're speaking the same language of what is politics. I don't know. I have a sister who lives in Columbus, Ohio. In fact, she lives in Jim Jordan's congressional district. And, of course, one of her U.S. senators is J.D. Vance. Now, my sister is not stupid. She's educated. But she really didn't even know that she lived in Jim Jordan's congressional district. And she says all the time, well, I'm not into politics. I say, you're not into politics. Well, politics is into you because your life is shaped by my understanding of what politics is or are. So I'm just not sure at times.
Reporting from Bangor, Pennsylvania, this is Miles Reese, Stony Brook Media Group.
Thank you again, Miles. But wait just there. Miles has more with President McCormick.
Right before we get into the words that Melba Tolliver, the amazing powerhouse journalist, just shared with us, I want to get to you, Mr. President. You mentioned something about the significance of the election of 1860. Do you mind expanding briefly more upon that?
The election of 1860 was, by all odds, the bitterest in American history. The nation was deeply divided over whether slavery should expand. Most Southerners believed slavery had to expand or die, and they wanted to expand it into the territories. Most Northerners had come to the conviction that it should not expand. The election was pitted Abraham Lincoln against several other candidates, two of whom believed in the expansion of slavery. The context for the election were fistfights in the streets, fistfights on the floor of Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was sitting at his desk in the Senate when a representative from South Carolina, a Democrat, came up and clubbed him over the head again and again and again with his stick. Sumner was so badly injured he could not return to the Senate for 3 years. In Kansas, fighting broke out on the ground between pro-slavery settlers and anti-slavery settlers. So the election was fought in the context of extreme bitterness over slavery. Yes. Lincoln won. The South refused to accept him as president. Southern states seceded, meaning they left the Union, or they tried to, and the Civil War followed.
And I want to expand upon that now. That was a very tumultuous time in history, and history has seemed to repeat itself. I want to go back to Melba Tolliver's notion that politics is involved in our lives, whether we like it or not. Would you also, this is a question for both of you actually, would you agree with the notion by Melba Tolliver that politics is in our lives whether we like it or not from a historical standpoint?
Yeah, I think we're impacted by the political sphere all the time. Even when we say we're apolitical or we want to stay outside of politics, we can't escape the impact of political decisions.
I would add that politics reflects our society. It is a reflection of social conflicts, social realities, beliefs, passions. It is probably in a democracy the most important vehicle for expressing those social feelings. So yeah, politics and the rest of life are deeply, indelibly connected.
Yes. Thank you, gentlemen, once again. I just want to thank you for joining our broadcast and joining our live, and thank you to the viewers at home. Once again, thank you for watching the election live coverage, and back to you guys at the studio.
Miles, thank you for that insightful interview. Up next, our reporter, Maya Duclay, will be interviewing Stanley Feldman, a professor of political science right here at Stony Brook University, for his thoughts on the ongoing election.
Hi, I'm Maya Duclay, and understanding the elections can be quite complicated. But luckily, I'm joined here today with Stanley Feldman, who is a professor in the political science department here at Stony Brook University for the past 30 years. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Of course. So, can you clearly explain to me what is the difference between the Electoral College and the popular vote?
So the U.S. is pretty unusual in that the presidential election does not depend upon the national popular vote. It depends entirely on the Electoral College vote. And the way the Electoral College is constructed, the way it was defined in the Constitution, each state gets a number of electors, and the number of electors are equal to the sum of the number of senators in that state and the number of members of the House of Representatives. So the smallest number any state has in the Electoral College in the electors is 3, 2 senators and 1 member of the House. Larger states obviously have many more Electoral College votes. With a couple of minor exceptions, whoever wins the plurality of votes in the states gets all of those Electoral College votes. So it doesn't matter what the margin is. A candidate who wins by 10,000 votes in, say, Pennsylvania, or 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania gets all of the Electoral College votes from Pennsylvania. In the end, when those Electoral College votes are allocated, the winning candidate needs a majority of the Electoral College votes, which right now is 270. So as the evening goes on and election winners are declared in the states, you'll start seeing the Electoral College votes add up for the 2 candidates, and their goal is that whoever gets to at least 270 is elected president.
And then what would you say are the most pressing issues? What should voters really be looking out for this election?
The big issue overriding everything is probably the economy. Even though inflation is by and large under control at the moment, people still are processing and remembering the increase in prices in supermarkets, for homes, for all sorts of consumer goods that they've had to deal with over the last couple of years. And so that memory hasn't faded yet. So a lot of people are still pessimistic about the economy and angry about inflation. And so that is, for many people, a big issue. Even though economic statistics at the moment are looking pretty good, and we'll see whether or not that over the next month that helps. But there's no question that for a lot of voters, the state of the economy and their concerns about how the Biden administration's responsibility for the economy is played out is a big issue. So that's in everybody's mind. The Harris and the Trump campaigns are really emphasizing different issues that they think work for them. So for Kamala Harris, she's spending a lot of time talking about reproductive rights, about abortion access, and about the consequences of the Supreme Court reversing Roe v. Wade. And so that is something that she's speaking about constantly, talking about, and laying the blame for the abortion restrictions that have taken over in the states to Donald Trump, who appointed 3 of the Supreme Court justices who voted to overturn Roe. So that's a very big issue for her, and she's spending a lot of time talking about that. For Donald Trump, he has been talking about the economy, but he, in addition to that, has also been talking a lot about crime and immigration. Somewhat less about crime, but a lot about immigration and the border. And so you see a lot of time that he spends at his campaign events and the direction his campaign is taking, emphasizing border security, talking about the number of people who he says are in the country illegally and what he would do about that, talking about potentially deporting millions of people who are not legally in the country. So that is probably the overriding issue that he is talking about at the moment. There is a back and forth on immigration as there is on reproductive rights. Donald Trump and other Republicans are trying to figure out how to take a position on abortion rights and reproductive rights that's consistent with their past positions on the issue. Kamala Harris has been taking a much tougher line on border security than Democrats have been lately. So there's clearly both campaigns are adjusting, but a lot of what we're hearing is reproductive rights, abortion, immigration, and especially undocumented workers in the U.S.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, Sky, joining us now in the studio to talk about the importance of student voting is Rick Gateau, Stony Brook's Vice President for Student Affairs. Thanks for joining us, Rick. The first question is, why do you think student voting is important during this election?
Well, thank you both for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. Well, I think voting is very important, and particularly being at Stony Brook, knowing a lot of our students tonight and today are first-time voters. Voting is critical because it speaks to what our constitutional right is, and when the Constitution was formed, it gave every American over time the right to vote and to share their voice and to have an impact on both the policies and decisions and laws that govern our country. And so today I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of our students who are at the polls on campus, and they share with me that this is their chance to get their voice heard and to influence how our laws work and to make change in the country as well. And so you can't have a voice in the world if you don't vote.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to know more about what Student Affairs and the university administration at large has really done to encourage students coming out to vote in the lead up to this election cycle, especially with this election being as divisive as it has been in recent history.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, let me take it back in time a bit, because about 6 years ago, we as a campus, and obviously in our society as a democracy, we wanted to play our role as a public institution in encouraging students not only to learn about the voting process, but to make sure they're registered to vote. Because if you're not registered to vote, you can't vote. And so about 6 years ago, we developed the Center for Civic Justice at Stony Brook. And a main part of that center is to ensure that students, as they enter the university, are aware of their right to vote, the process of voting, because again, many of our students, they're 17 or 18 the first time coming to college and learning about that process. So we work from orientation through the time of election season to make sure students are registered to vote, they understand the voting process, and to then encourage voting. And so today, being election day, we've done a lot of work up to that point to make sure as many students are registered to vote, whether they've also done absentee ballots if they live in another area of the country, and also even today as well, being a polling site on campus, so making it accessible for students to be able to vote as well. And I'm happy to say when I visited the rec center today, a couple of times we've had lots of long lines and students, again, exercising their right to vote. And we also have a big watch party going on tonight, and certainly watching you on TV as well tonight, which is very exciting for us.
And with that being said, like in every election, students voice concerns of my voice doesn't matter, what's the point of doing this? What would you say to students who feel like their vote doesn't matter and that their voice is just
I've heard that sometimes people think, well, my vote wouldn't matter at all. But what if everybody said that and there was never a vote cast? How would you ever make change in the world or want a particular law or policy to change? As we said, you mentioned, Sky, about being a divisive election, and in many ways we are a divided country. And I think that's why it's even more important to vote, so that we know what the majority of Americans will want in terms of their local representatives, their state representatives, and then at the national level, at the presidential level. And so my argument is that this is where one part of society where there's equity in that every single vote actually does count equally.
Definitely agree. And also, with that being said, with going back in time, what was your first feeling, voting, being there for national elections? Like, what was that first feeling of going to the polls? Just to put it in perspective for a lot of students.
Yeah, no, I love that, because I remember my first year in college was my first year of voting. I turned 18 in college, and I actually did an absentee ballot to then vote. I went to school in Pennsylvania, but voted for Long Island. And I have to say, it was like my civic duty to do so. I felt that not only became the age where you could vote, so you want to then take that responsibility seriously and cast your ballot. So that was a fun time for me. It wasn't as exciting because I wasn't going to the polls. In the next election, when I was back on Long Island, I remember going to my first voting site, and it was exciting to be able to do that, to make my voice heard. And I have voted in every election ever since I turned 18, because I think I view it as our civic responsibility to do so. And I'm so glad I now work on a college campus where we've done a lot where you start the habit early in your life. Because if you start at 18, my view is you're more likely to continue to vote in all the future elections, not just the presidential one.
Yeah. Right. It's something I'm curious about. You had mentioned earlier that you had paid a visit to the recreation center where the university has transformed the space into a polling site for students to vote.
Yes.
I'd love to hear some more about what you thought the overall attitude was. What do you think was the vibe almost from students there who were all lining up? Like you said, many of them are first-time voters. Describe some of the feelings, some of what students told you.
Sure. I had a chance to talk to a lot of students waiting in line, and just to get them excited. Well, first of all, I was so happy to see people show up, because there's one thing to register to vote, but there's another thing to go and show up and actually vote. And the fact, too, that in New York that we have early voting, I think was a big positive to get people out earlier. But day of, there's just a lot of excitement as well, because a lot of the students volunteering to help all wore their, Seawolves Vote and their Wolfie t-shirt, and they also had stickers to show that they voted. So I viewed it as a sense of Seawolves pride that people took their responsibility seriously to make their voice heard. And so even if they had to wait in line, they were willing to do so to make sure they were part of the process. And so again, I'm just so happy that we had a very strong turnout today.
And with elections coming around, there's always a great sense of tension in the atmosphere. Why do you feel as if it is, important for students to put aside that differences of who they're voting for and really just come together as a community?
Right. Look, I think we have to accept the fact that there are always going to be differences of opinion, and I think there has been in a sense, a schism in our society now, really, I think, divisive rhetoric happening. And so we need to make sure that we, again, accept the outcome of the election, and that we are going to make sure, it doesn't mean you still can't have your voice heard if the candidate you voted for didn't win, there are still opportunities to engage, I would view, in the democratic process of still sharing your voice and making sure your position is heard. You don't have to be an elected official in order to make your voice heard. And I know that we have many of our political affiliated organizations on our campus who will still actively be involved in that process because, again, there are always elections every 2 and 4 years. So if your candidate didn't win this time around, you have an opportunity to, again, engage in that democratic process, bring the issues at hand, make people aware of why a certain viewpoint is one that maybe they want to. And this is also about coalition building, about making sure that people gravitate towards ideas that they think they can get behind. I mean, this is part of a democratic process. And so, again, we have to live with an outcome of an election, but also still know that as Americans, we have the right, and part of it is the right to freedom of speech, to share our views and our positions on issues, to try to convince others to believe in what we believe. And then that will then, again, we go through the next cycle of the election process again.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who works as a leader in Stony Brook University's administration, I'd love to get your perspective on the role that public universities and public education sort of play in encouraging these first-time voters and students to really just engage in the democratic process. You know, what do public universities do that helps these students vote?
Well, you're speaking to my passion about working at a public institution, because one of the pieces of working in a public institution that we espouse is around access and opportunity. And so because the U.S. Constitution gives us the right to vote, that aligns very well with our values as a public institution around wanting to make sure people have equitable access, not only to an education, but also to the right to vote. So while an education institution like Stony Brook, certainly we care about the learning you have in the classroom from a historical perspective, as the president and dean shared earlier in this broadcast. We want to make sure students understand the history, but also take the action step of actually voting. So I view it as the learning in the classroom, then the action is we have a polling site on campus and you engage in that democratic process. So I view them as synergistic in what we're trying to do, being part of a public university like Stony Brook as a leader in this space.
I think that's like very, very important, you know, just students being active, getting their voices out, you know, we both voted. I'm hoping that you voted as well today.
I already voted. I did early voting, which I was thrilled with. And speaking of it, I think it's also very important that you and all of our students at Stony Brook, you are our future leaders. You're our future senators, maybe a future president in the group, ambassadors of the United Nations. All of the decision makers are here. So I love that people are learning about this process as early as possible to understand, because many of our students, I hope, will be involved in politics in the future and help shape our country. This is a really important part. And my view is college is the right time to start.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to say about student voting at Stony Brook or beyond?
No, I just want to still encourage, we've still got a little bit of time left, so I encourage people, 9 o'clock the polls close in New York, so I would encourage everyone, even our on-campus polling site is still open till 9 o'clock tonight, so please exercise your right to vote, because it is something that we should, safeguard and protect, because it's something that the U.S. worked hard to include in the Constitution, and we want to make sure everyone's involved in the democratic process.
Excellent. Well, Rick Coteau, Vice President for Student Affairs here at Stony Brook University. We understand you have a very busy schedule. Yeah. We really appreciate the time you took to come on our show and talk about the importance of student voting. Thank you for stopping by.
My pleasure. Thank you both so much.
Of course. All right. Once again, I'm Sky Crabtree. Stay tuned for the latest developments on this crucial presidential election. Reporter Adrian Esposito talking to the College Democrats and Republicans here on Stony Brook University's campus.
The world is watching the general election between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. Closer to home here at Stony Brook, we're in Congressional District 1. This district has an extremely exciting race between current Republican incumbent Nick LaLota and Democratic challenger John Avlon. I spoke to some e-board members of the College Democrats and the College Republicans to get their thoughts on the election.
Abortion, healthcare, and public transportation.
Immigration, guns, and the economy.
Kamala Harris should win because she believes in a lot of democratic values that really reflect what this country has become over time.
Man of the people, he literally went to McDonald's to start cooking for people. Yeah, Trump literally got shot for our country.
The polls are predicting tight races all around. For the Stony Brook Media Group, I'm Adrian Esposito.
Thank you. And now our reporter Maya Duclay showcasing the effort of two former enemies now trying to repair division in the United States.
Today we heard from two dads defending democracy. Fred Guttenberg started his public life after the tragic loss of his daughter Jamie in the 2018 Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting down in Parkland, Florida. Joe Walsh is the former Republican congressman for the state of Illinois. They had a lot to say about the future and what is in store for America's democracy. People started coming into the Humanities Building for the panel. Provost Carl Lejouet was there introducing the panel and the guests. Fred Guttenberg is a gun safety advocate.
We want democracy in America to go forward and to survive. We want the important issues that matter to us. For me personally, it's gun violence prevention.
Fred Guttenberg lost his daughter Jamie at the age of 14 in 2018. This is why he says it's important to go vote.
Nothing matters more to our participation in a democracy than our vote. If we don't vote, we have no voice. We have no power. Our vote is our power.
Former Congressman Joe Walsh feels similarly about the matter.
You got two options. You can just say my vote doesn't matter, or you can get involved and try to change the system so your vote does matter. Don't give up. Yeah.
I'm Maya Duclay for the Stony Brook Media Group.
Thanks, Maya. And now, another interview with Stanley Feldman by our reporter, Brittany Dietz.
Stanley Feldman, who is a professor in the political science department here at Stony Brook University for the past 30 years. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Could you expand further on Harris's, what she plans to implement for border protection?
One of the things that she has been talking about is that there was a bipartisan bill that was crafted by Republicans and Democrats in the Senate that would have made asylum requests more difficult, would have allocated a lot more money for border security, that money would have been able to go for agents to patrol the borders, also for judges to be able to take on cases of people asking for asylum much more quickly. That bill never got to a vote because Republicans decided to oppose it. And part of the reason she argues that they decided to oppose it is because Donald Trump was not in favor of it. So a major part of her talking points is to revive that bill. So to spend more money on border security, on agents to patrol the border, especially on judges, because right now it takes years when somebody asks for asylum in the U.S. before their case can be heard. So basically her argument is that, we need stricter controls at the border. We need stronger measures for people applying for asylum, and especially we need to be able to deal with those cases much more quickly than we do now.
Okay. And then do you have any message that you'd like to share to voters on Election Day?
So obviously the two presidential candidates are very far apart on many issues, including others. Donald Trump's position on taxes is very different from Kamala Harris's position on taxes. Who would pay more taxes? Donald Trump talking a lot about tariffs. So there are big differences between the two candidates. And even with Harris talking about being tougher on the border and allowing people into the U.S., still a fairly dramatic difference in how the two candidates would handle that. The other thing that people need to remember, because it's easy to forget with all the attention on the presidential election, is that there are elections for the Senate and for the House of Representatives. And both of those legislative bodies are so close at the moment that one or two Senate seats going Democratic or Republican, and literally a handful of House seats going Democrat or Republican, can determine which party has the majority in the House and which party has the majority in the Senate for at least the next 2 years. And that's critically important. It's important because a president that doesn't have majorities in the House and in the Senate has a very difficult time passing legislation, getting their cabinet appointments through, getting their Supreme Court justices through. People shouldn't lose sight of those Senate elections, and especially the House elections. There doesn't seem to be a very competitive Senate election in New York at the moment, but there are several very competitive House races, including the district that includes Stony Brook. And as I said, across the country, a handful, 5 House seats, switching from Republican to Democratic control would change the majority in the House of Representatives. 1 or 2 Senate seats will change going from Democrat to Republican, could change the majority in the Senate from its current Democratic majority to a Republican majority. So people should keep in mind that those Senate races and House races are really important this year.
Thank you so much for being here today, Stanley.
So how are we feeling, Sky? Do you think that we'll have a clear winner by the end of the night, or do you think it's going to be a neck-and-neck battle to the very end?
I think it's going to drag on for a long time. The battleground states, especially, obviously they're known for being, well, battlegrounds for campaigns, but they are really the deciding players, in this election. I saw something really interesting earlier, though, was that a recent poll had flipped Iowa in favor of Harris, and this has been very strongly, very historically a Republican state. Not a battleground state, but this recent poll, and it was done by a very credible pollster, had shown that Harris had around a 3 to 4% lead in Iowa over former President Donald Trump. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's extremely interesting, considering you said it is a Republican state now flipping to Iowa. Now you have the swing states as well. People are looking at them to see which side they will land on, either Trump or Harris. But with that being said, I think it kind of gives you that that excitement of, okay, what states are going to really have this historical shift and really change to being a Democratic state or even going into a Republican state. So I think that's going to be extremely interesting. I know today for myself, I was very excited to go to the polls, vote for my candidate, just be active and do my civic duty to just be involved within my community and my country.
Right, and because a lot of the news cycle and a lot of the campaign efforts have been focused on these battleground states, so I think that one poll in Iowa is really interesting to show that even if everyone's attention really are on these states that analysts say could flip either way in this upcoming election, that there is still a possibility for states that we thought were settled at this point to flip the other way and maybe even upend the election and the amount of electoral college votes needed for the candidate to win the White House. What do you think?
I think that's extremely big. With CBS doing their recent poll showing 49%, it's clear that Americans are divided on who will be the clear winner. I think when we look at previous elections, it was kind of understood on who would win ideally. In 2016, the devastating loss that Clinton faced, where many people thought it was going to be a landslide win, and then having Donald Trump easily just take it, I think that was something significant. So I'm excited to see where this goes. One end, we have the opportunity of having the first African-American woman to be in office, and at another end, Trump going on again for another term. I think it's going to be truly interesting and truly a great result.
Right, and the 2016 election was particularly notable because it was one of the few times in history that the Electoral College decided who won. Usually the popular vote and the Electoral College line up for each state, but this time in the 2016 election, Clinton had actually won a bigger percentage of the popular vote, yet Trump still won because of the Electoral College. Right. And now we will be taking an intermission till around 9 p.m. We will see you back then for live election coverage and analysis. We're going to have reporters at the Democratic and Republican Party headquarters here in Suffolk County and at the Union Ballroom here at Stony Brook University, where they are putting on a election watch party. We're going to be talking to students, voters, getting their reactions as the results unfold. Once again, I'm Sky Crabtree.
And I'm Andrew Candio. On behalf of the Stony Brook Media Group, we thank you for tuning in.